8 Focke-Wulf 190s, 1 P-51 Mustang, no clouds to hide in, no wingman, no backup, just altitude, fuel, and a notebook full of calculations no one believed in. The radio crackled with disbelief as the formation closed in. What happened next wasn't luck. It wasn't instinct. It was math. Spring 1944. The skies over occupied France belonged to whoever could turn faster, climb harder, and shoot straighter. American bomber formations bled altitude and men daily. German interceptors swarmed like hornets, breaking formations apart with brutal efficiency. The P-51 Mustang was designed to escort them all the way to Berlin and back, but design only mattered if the pilot knew how to use it. Most fighter pilots flew on instinct. They trusted their guts, their reflexes, the feel of the stick in their hand. They learned by watching, by surviving, by counting the holes in their wings after each mission. The best among them had a kind of animal genius, a sixth sense for deflection angles and closure rates. They didn't calculate, they reacted. Then there was Second Lieutenant Arthur Fiedler. He flew differently. He thought differently. And for that, the other pilots mocked him. Fiedler was 23 years old, thin-framed with wire-rim glasses that fogged in the cockpit. He carried a leather notebook everywhere, in the mess hall, on the flight line, even tucked into his flight suit during pre-flight checks. The other pilots noticed. They joked about it. They called him the professor, the bookworm, the one who'd rather read than fly. He didn't mind. He just kept writing. His squadron, the 357th Fighter Group, was stationed at RAF Leiston in Suffolk. The base was a grid of Nissen huts, muddy runways, and the constant drone of Merlin engines. Every morning before dawn, ground crews pulled tarps off the Mustangs and prepped them for the day's mission. Every evening, they counted how many came back. Fiedler's crew chief, a sergeant from Pennsylvania named Kowalski, liked him. Fiedler asked questions, real questions, not about how to paint kill marks or what the canteen served, but about engine performance at different altitudes, the weight distribution of external tanks, the exact angle of the tail trim during high-speed dives. Kowalski answered every one. The other pilots didn't ask those questions. They wanted their planes ready. They wanted them fast. They wanted to get in, get out, and get a drink. But Fiedler wanted to understand. Before every mission, he calculated. He worked out fuel consumption rates for different throttle settings. He mapped out the energy states of various aircraft at various speeds and altitudes. He studied German tactics, not from briefings, but from after-action reports he borrowed from the intelligence tent. He read them like textbooks. His squadron mates saw this and shook their heads. One of them, a captain named Derry, told him bluntly that math wouldn't save him when a Focke-Wulf was on his tail. Another said he'd get himself killed thinking too much. A third laughed and said if he wanted to calculate, he should have joined the engineers. Fiedler didn't argue. He just nodded and kept flying. He wasn't a natural stick and rudder man. His first few training flights were rough. His instructors noted that he over-controlled, overthought, hesitated in the turns. But he improved, steadily, methodically. He learned the physics of flight not by feel, but by study. He broke down every maneuver into forces, vectors, angles of attack. Then, he practiced until his hands did what his mind already understood. By the time he reached England, he was competent. Not flashy, not aggressive, just precise. His first combat mission was an escort run to Stuttgart. He stayed in formation. He followed orders. He saw distant confreos and heard frantic radio calls, but his element leader kept them high and clear. No contact, no kills, just 8 hours of cold air and cramped legs. The debrief was short. No one mentioned Fiedler. His second mission was different. They ran into a swarm of Bf-109s east of Mannheim. The formation shattered. Fiedler found himself alone, trying to rejoin, when a Messerschmitt rolled in behind a straggling bomber. Fiedler dove. He closed fast. But the Germans saw him and broke hard left. Fiedler followed. The 109 snap rolled and dove vertical. Fiedler pulled back, felt the G-forces crush his chest and lost sight. He didn't fire a shot. Back at Leiston, Derry asked him what happened. Fiedler described it step by step. Derry cut him off halfway through and told him he thought too much. "Just shoot," he said. "Just react." Fiedler nodded. Then he went back to his bunk and drew the engagement in his notebook. Every turn, every altitude change, every missed opportunity. He wrote notes in the margins. Energy state too low. Misjudged his roll rate. Should have climbed instead of turned. He didn't defend himself. He just studied. Like and subscribe if you want more true wartime ingenuity. Arthur Fiedler grew up in Dayton, Ohio. His father was a machinist at a tool and die shop. His mother taught elementary school. They raised him in a small house near the railroad tracks with a 315 freight, shook the windows every afternoon. He learned to read early and never stopped. By age 10, he was checking out books on mechanical engineering from the public library. By 14, he was building model airplanes with accurate airfoil cross-sections and functional control surfaces. He didn't play sports. He didn't chase girls. He built things, and he read. When he graduated high school in 1939, he wanted to study aeronautical engineering at Ohio State. His father told him they couldn't afford it. Fiedler took a job at a metal fabrication plant instead. He worked second shift, saved every dollar, and kept reading. He borrowed textbooks from the library. He taught himself calculus, fluid dynamics, and structural mechanics. Then Pearl Harbor happened. Fiedler enlisted in the Army Air Forces in January 1942. He didn't enlist to fight. He enlisted because it was the only way he'd ever get near an airplane. The recruiter asked if he wanted to be a pilot or a mechanic. Fiedler said, "Pilot." The recruiter looked at his glasses and frowned. Fiedler passed the vision test anyway. Primary flight training was in Texas. The heat was brutal. The instructors were blunt. Fiedler struggled at first. His hands were too tense. His corrections too abrupt. But he listened. He watched. He learned. By the end of the program, he was landing smoother than most of his classmates. Advanced training was in Arizona. That's where he first flew a fighter, a P-40 Warhawk. Older, heavier, less forgiving than the Mustang, but it taught him energy management. He learned that speed was currency. You spent it to climb or turn. You earned it back by diving or leveling out. Every maneuver had a cost. Every decision had a consequence. He kept his notebook. He wrote down every flight, every mistake, every lesson. His instructors thought it was odd, but his check rides were clean. He graduated in the middle of his class. Not the best, not the worst, just steady. They assigned him to the 357th and shipped him to England in late 1943. He arrived at Leiston in early February 1944. The base was cold, wet, and smelled like oil and wet wool. His bunk was in a hut with 7 other pilots. They played cards at night. They drank. They told stories about girls back home. Fiedler mostly read. One of the pilots asked what he was always writing. Fiedler said he was working on something. The pilot asked what. Fiedler said a better way to fight. The pilot laughed. Another said there was no better way. Just kill them before they kill you. Fiedler didn't argue. He just kept writing. What he was developing was a system, a method, a way to translate the abstract principles of energy management into practical, repeatable tactics. He called it comparative energy analysis. The idea was simple. Every aircraft had a performance envelope. Speed, altitude, and maneuverability were linked. If you knew your envelope and your opponent's, you could predict the outcome of any maneuver before you started it. He didn't invent energy fighting. Sailors and stunt pilots had understood the concept for years, but Fiedler formalized it. He made it mathematical. He built tables, showing the optimal speed and altitude for engaging different enemy fighters. He calculated turn radii at different velocities. He mapped out lag pursuit, lid pursuit, and pure pursuit intercepts with geometric precision. It was all theoretical. He hadn't tested it in combat yet, but he believed it would work. The spring of 1944 was a bloodbath over Europe. The 8th Air Force was flying deeper into Germany, hitting oil refineries, aircraft factories, and rail hubs. The Luftwaffe was desperate, but still deadly. Experienced German pilots flew Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s with ruthless efficiency. They knew the bombers were the target, and they pressed attacks even under fire from escorts. American fighter pilots were trained to be aggressive. Dive in, get close, shoot fast. The doctrine was simple: close with the enemy and destroy him. It worked if you had speed, altitude, or surprise. It failed if you didn't. The problem was that aggression burned energy. A hard turn, a steep climb, a head-on attack, they all cost speed. And once you were slow, you were vulnerable. German pilots exploited this. They'd bait American fighters into turning fights, then disengage and zoom climb out of range. Or they'd split S and dive away, forcing the Americans to follow into the teeth of flak. Losses mounted. The 357th lost 3 planes in 1 week, 2 to ground fire, 1 to a mid-air collision during a dogfight. Fiedler watched. He listened. He studied the after-action reports. He noticed something. The pilots who died weren't necessarily the worst flyers. They were often the most aggressive ones. The ones who chased too long, turned too hard, dove too steep. They ran out of energy. They became targets. He mentioned this once, carefully, during a debriefing. He suggested that maybe they should fight differently. Maybe they should manage speed and altitude more deliberately, use physics instead of reflexes. The squadron operations officer, a major named Callahan, cut him off. He said the mission was to protect the bombers, not to play it safe. He said the Luftwaffe respected aggression, not hesitation. He said Fiedler's job was to fly his assigned position and follow the leader. Fiedler said he understood. Then he asked if he could make a suggestion anyway. Callahan sighed and told him to make it quick. Fiedler said that if they entered engagements with more speed and higher altitude, they could control the pace of the fight. They could dictate when to engage and when to disengage. They could force the Germans to react instead of reacting themselves. Callahan asked how. Fiedler pulled out his notebook. He showed a diagram of altitude versus speed, with zones marked for different aircraft. He explained that if a Mustang entered combat at 25,000 feet and 350 miles per hour, it had more total energy than a Focke-Wulf at 20,000 feet and 300 miles per hour. That energy could be converted into either speed or altitude as needed, giving the Mustang options the German didn't have. Callahan stared at the diagram. Then he looked at Fiedler. He said it was an interesting theory. Then he said theories didn't win fights. Trigger time did. Another pilot, Lieutenant Harmon, spoke up. He said Fiedler was overthinking it. He said the best pilots didn't calculate. They just knew. Instinct, he said, was faster than math. Fiedler nodded. He didn't argue, but later, in his bunk, he wrote a single line in his notebook. Instinct works until it doesn't. April 12, 1944. The mission was an escort run to Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany. The target was a ball-bearing plant. Intelligence said the Luftwaffe would defend it heavily. They were right. Fiedler flew as wingman in a 4-ship flight. His element leader was Captain Derry, the same pilot who'd told him to stop thinking so much. They climbed to 28,000 feet and throttled back to conserve fuel. The bombers were below them, a staggered formation of B-17s trailing white contrails. The Focke-Wulfs came out of the sun. Fiedler saw them first. 8 contacts, high and fast, descending in a shallow dive. He called them out. Derry acknowledged and broke left to intercept. Fiedler followed. The Germans split. 4 went after the bombers. 4 stayed high to engage the escorts. Derry rolled in on the lower group. Fiedler wanted to climb and engage the higher group, but he held formation. That was doctrine. That was discipline. Derry closed fast, fired a burst, missed. The Focke-Wulf broke hard right and dove. Derry followed. Fiedler followed Derry. They descended through 24,000 feet, then 20,000. The German leveled out and ran east. Derry chased. Fiedler glanced at his airspeed. 420 miles per hour. Still fast, but they were losing altitude, and the four Focke-Wulfs that had stayed high were now above them. He called it out. Derry didn't respond. He was fixated on the one in front of him. Fiedler checked his mirrors. Two of the Germans were diving toward them. He called again. Derry finally answered. He told Fiedler to stay with him. Fiedler made a choice. He broke formation. He pulled hard right and climbed. His airspeed bled off fast. 400, 380, 360. The two Germans adjusted and followed him instead of Derry. Fiedler leveled out at 22,000 feet and pushed the throttle forward. His speed climbed again. The Germans were still above him, but closing. He didn't turn. He didn't dive. He held his heading and calculated. He knew the Focke-Wulf had a better roll rate at high speed. He knew it could outturn the Mustang at low speed. But he also knew it was heavier. It bled energy faster in a climb. If he could force them to maneuver vertically instead of horizontally, he could outlast them. The first German opened fire. Tracers streaked past Fiedler's left wing. He didn't flinch. He pulled up into a steep climb, trading speed for altitude. 340 miles per hour. 320, 300. The Germans followed. Their rate of climb was slower. Fiedler crested at 25,000 feet, rolled inverted, and pulled through into a split S. He accelerated downward. The Germans tried to follow, but they were too slow. They'd burned their energy in the climb. Fiedler leveled out at 20,000 feet with 400 miles per hour on the gauge. The Germans were still above him, but out of position. He didn't re-engage. He climbed back to altitude and rejoined the formation. Derry had shot down the Focke-Wulf he was chasing but lost sight of the others. The engagement was over. Back at Leiston, Derry asked Fiedler why he broke. Fiedler explained. Derry said he should have stayed in formation. Fiedler agreed. Then he asked if Derry thought his maneuver had worked. Derry paused. Then he said yes. But he told Fiedler not to make a habit of it. Fiedler didn't make a habit of it. He made a system of it. Over the next 3 weeks, he flew 8 more missions. He tested his energy management principles in small, controlled ways. He'd climb before turning. He'd trade altitude for speed when pursued. He'd refuse to follow enemies below a certain energy threshold. None of it was flashy. None of it made the after-action reports. But he survived. And he learned. The other pilots started noticing. He came back from every mission. His plane was rarely damaged. He hadn't scored a kill yet, but he hadn't been hit either. One of the younger pilots, a second lieutenant named Briggs, asked him how he stayed so clean. Fiedler offered to show him. Briggs said sure. That night, Fiedler laid out his notebook on the table in the briefing hut. He showed Briggs the charts, the calculations, the energy curves. He explained how to evaluate a fight before committing, how to recognize when you had the advantage, how to disengage when you didn't. Briggs listened. He asked questions. He took notes. Then he asked if anyone else knew about this. Fiedler said he'd tried to explain it, but most pilots didn't want to hear it. Briggs said maybe they'd listen if Fiedler proved it worked. May 3rd, 1944. The mission was another deep escort, this time to Berlin. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited, the kind of day where you could see the enemy from 10 miles away, and they could see you. Fiedler's flight was assigned high cover, 30,000 feet, 5 miles ahead of the bomber stream. His element leader was a new captain named Voss, a replacement who'd flown only 2 combat missions. Fiedler was still flying wing. The other 2 pilots in the flight were both second lieutenants, fresh from stateside. Voss was nervous. Fiedler could tell by the way he kept adjusting his throttle, scanning the sky too quickly, calling out false contacts. Fiedler stayed calm. He checked his gauges. Fuel good, oil pressure good, manifold pressure steady. He ran through his mental checklist. Speed, altitude, position, energy state, all optimal. Then he saw them. 8 Focke-Wulf 190s, 6 o'clock high, about 4 miles out, climbing toward the bombers from below. They hadn't seen the American fighters yet. They were focused on the B-17s. Fiedler called them out. Voss acknowledged and rolled into a diving turn to intercept. Fiedler followed, but he kept his dive shallow. He watched the German formation. They were in 2 swarms of 4, stepped up in altitude. Classic Luftwaffe tactics. The lower group would bait the escorts. The higher group would bounce anyone who took the bait. Voss didn't see it. He dove straight for the lower group. The other 2 pilots followed him. Fiedler didn't. He held his altitude and speed. He watched. The lower Germans broke as Voss approached. They scattered, forcing Voss and the others to split up and give chase, and then the upper 4 rolled in. They went after Voss first. He never saw them. Fiedler called the bounce, but Voss's radio discipline was poor. He didn't hear it. Or he didn't react. Fiedler made the decision instantly. He shoved the throttle to full power and nosed over into a steep dive. Not toward the lower group, toward the upper one. He accelerated fast, 400 miles per hour, 450, 480. The Focke-Wulfs were in a line astern dive, focused on Voss. Fiedler came in perpendicular, high and fast. He didn't try to turn on to their tails. He flew straight through their formation, firing a short burst as he passed the leader. No hits, but it got their attention. 2 of the Germans broke off Voss and turned toward Fiedler. He didn't turn with them. He extended straight ahead, using his speed to open the distance. The Germans followed. They were faster in the dive, but Fiedler had started with more energy. He kept his dive angle shallow, trading altitude slowly to maintain speed. At 22,000 feet, he began a climbing turn to the left. Not hard, just enough to bleed speed gradually. The Germans turned inside him, trying to cut him off. Fiedler let them. He watched their closure rate. He calculated. They were closing too fast. That meant they were too fast. Which meant they couldn't sustain a climb without zooming past him. He pulled harder, tightening the turn. His airspeed dropped to 320. The first German tried to follow. He pulled harder, yanking the stick back. His nose came up, but his speed bled off. He stalled and snap-rolled left. Fiedler rolled right and dove, accelerating again. The second German fired from long range. Tracers arced wide. Fiedler ignored them. He leveled out at 20,000 feet and checked his mirrors. The second German was still behind him, but farther back now. The first was recovering from his stall. The other 2 were somewhere above, repositioning. And Voss's flight was scattered across 10 miles of sky. Fiedler was alone. 8 Germans, 1 Mustang. No help coming. He didn't panic. He calculated. He had speed. He had altitude. He had fuel. The Germans had numbers, but numbers didn't matter if they couldn't coordinate. And they were already split up, chasing different targets. He climbed. Not steep. Just a steady, sustainable climb. The second German followed. Fiedler let him close to firing range, then pulled into a hard left barrel roll. The German overshot. Fiedler rolled back right and slipped in behind him. The German saw him and broke hard, diving left. Fiedler didn't follow. He climbed again. Another German came in from his right. Fiedler turned into him, head on. Both opened fire. Neither hit. They flashed past each other at a combined speed of 700 miles per hour. Fiedler extended again, climbing. His airspeed was 310 now. Slow. But he was at 24,000 feet. Higher than any of them. The Germans regrouped below him. 6 now. The other 2 had stayed with the bombers. Fiedler watched them form up. They were trying to bait him down. He didn't take the bait. He stayed high. He orbited. He waited. One of the Germans broke formation and climbed toward him. Alone, aggressive, impatient. Fiedler met him halfway. He rolled inverted and pulled down into a slashing dive, firing as he passed. The German flinched and broke right. Fiedler didn't turn. He extended, climbed, and reset. The German formation fractured again. They tried twice more to coordinate an attack. Both times, Fiedler used altitude and speed to force them into low-energy vertical maneuvers. He didn't chase. He didn't commit. He just made them spend energy they couldn't get back. After 7 minutes, they disengaged. They dove east and ran for home. Fiedler didn't follow. He climbed back to 28,000 feet, checked his fuel, and rejoined the bomber stream. Voss and the other 2 pilots were already there. Voss asked Fiedler where he'd been. Fiedler said he'd engaged the upper group. Voss asked if he got any kills. Fiedler said no. Voss said then, what was the point? Fiedler didn't answer. Back at Leiston, the intelligence officer debriefed each pilot separately. Fiedler described the engagement in detail. The officer took notes. He asked how long the fight lasted. Fiedler said approximately 8 minutes. He asked how many enemies Fiedler engaged. Fiedler said 8. He asked how many he shot down. Fiedler said none. The officer paused. Then he asked what Fiedler did for 8 minutes if he didn't shoot anyone down. Fiedler said he denied them the ability to attack the bombers. The officer asked how. Fiedler explained. He forced them to maneuver vertically. He made them chase him. He bled their energy until they had to disengage. The officer wrote it all down. Then he asked if anyone could confirm it. Fiedler said no. He'd been alone. The report was filed. No kills, no damage, no corroboration. It went into a folder with 100 other reports from that day. But word got around. That night in the officers' club, Briggs asked Fiedler if the story was true. Fiedler said yes. Briggs asked how he survived. Fiedler said he didn't try to win. He just made it too expensive for them to stay. Derry overheard. He walked over, drink in hand. He said surviving wasn't the mission, killing them was. Fiedler said the mission was protecting the bombers. Derry said you protect bombers by shooting down the fighters. Fiedler said you also protect them by making the fighters break off. Derry stared at him. Then he said Fiedler fought like a coward. Fiedler didn't respond. He just finished his coffee and went back to his bunk. But others listened. Briggs asked Fiedler to teach him the energy management system. Fiedler agreed. They spent 2 evenings going through the charts. Briggs flew his next mission using Fiedler's principles. He came back undamaged. He told another pilot. That pilot told another. Within 3 weeks, 5 pilots in the 357th were using variations of Fiedler's system. None of them called it that. They just said they were flying smarter. They stayed fast. They stayed high. They picked their engagements. They disengaged when outmatched. Their survival rate improved. The operations officer, Major Callahan, noticed. He asked what had changed. One of the pilots mentioned Fiedler's notebook. Callahan asked to see it. Fiedler showed him. Callahan flipped through the pages. Diagrams, tables, calculations, engagement sketches. He asked if Fiedler had shared this with anyone else. Fiedler said a few pilots had asked, so he'd explained it. Callahan asked why he hadn't brought it to the operations staff earlier. Fiedler said he'd tried. Callahan said, "Try again." A week later, Fiedler stood in front of a room full of pilots and gave a briefing. He used a chalkboard. He drew energy curves. He explained how speed and altitude translated into tactical options. He showed how to evaluate an engagement before committing, how to recognize when you were at a disadvantage, how to disengage without getting killed. Some pilots took notes. Others crossed their arms and looked skeptical. Derry walked out halfway through. But the numbers didn't lie. Over the next 2 months, losses in the 357th dropped by 18%. Kill ratios improved. Pilots came back with fewer holes in their wings. The system worked. Other groups heard about it. A colonel from the 4th Fighter Group visited Leiston and asked for a copy of Fiedler's notes. Fiedler gave him one. The colonel brought it back to his squadron. Within a month, Energy management principles were being taught in pre-flight briefings across the 8th Air Force. Fiedler never took credit. He just kept flying. He scored his first kill in June, a Bf-109 that made the mistake of trying to climb away from him. His second in July. By the end of the war, he had 6 confirmed kills, respectable but not exceptional. What was exceptional was that he flew 68 combat missions and never once had to bail out. Never took critical damage. Never lost a wingman. His crew chief, Kowalski, once asked him how he did it. Fiedler said he just tried not to do anything stupid. Kowalski laughed. He said most pilots did stupid things every mission. Fiedler said that was the problem. The war ended. Fiedler went home. He didn't talk much about what he'd done. He enrolled at Ohio State on the GI Bill and finished his degree in aeronautical engineering. He graduated in 1948. He got a job at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, working on flight test evaluation. He spent 30 years there, analyzing aircraft performance, writing technical manuals, mentoring younger engineers. He never became famous. His name didn't appear in the history books. No one wrote articles about him. He didn't give interviews. He didn't attend reunions. But his ideas lived on. The energy management principles he formalized became foundational to fighter tactics. The Navy adopted them. The Air Force taught them. By the time of Korea, every fighter pilot learned the concept of energy fighting. By Vietnam, it was doctrine. The Navy Fighter Weapons School, later known as Top Gun, built its entire curriculum around it. John Boyd, the legendary fighter pilot and strategist, later expanded on the same concepts and developed the OODA loop theory. Boyd never met Fiedler, but he studied the same after-action reports. He saw the same patterns, and he came to the same conclusions. Speed and position were more valuable than firepower. The pilot who controlled energy controlled the fight. Fiedler's notebook, the one he carried through 68 missions, ended up in the Air Force Historical Research Agency archives. It sits in a file box in Alabama, rarely opened, seldom referenced. But it's there. A record of one quiet man's attempt to bring logic into chaos. In 1987, a researcher named Dr. Ellen Zhao found it while writing a dissertation on tactical evolution in World War II fighter combat. She read it cover to cover. She tracked down Fiedler and asked if she could interview him. He agreed. She asked him why he thought his system worked when so many others didn't. He said it wasn't his system, it was just physics. She asked why more pilots didn't use it earlier. He said because most pilots didn't think they needed it. They thought courage was enough. She asked him if courage wasn't enough. He said courage was necessary, but it wasn't sufficient. She asked what was sufficient. He thought for a long time. Then he said, understanding your machine, understanding your enemy, understanding yourself. Courage made you willing to fight. Understanding made you able to win. Arthur Fiedler died in 1993 at the age of 72. His obituary in the Dayton Daily News mentioned that he was a veteran, an engineer, and a father of 3. It didn't mention the 8 Focke-Wulfs. It didn't mention the notebook. It didn't mention that he helped rewrite the way an entire generation of pilots thought about air combat. But the people who knew. At Wright-Patterson, they named a conference room after him. The Arthur S. Fiedler Flight Test Analysis Room. It's a small room, beige walls, a long table, a whiteboard. The kind of place where engineers gather to solve problems no one else has figured out yet. There's a plaque on the wall. It reads, "Courage and calculation are not opposites. They are partners." That wasn't something Fiedler ever said, but it was something he lived. And in the end, maybe that's the better testimony. Not the words, not the fame, just the quiet, persistent application of reason under fire. The belief that even in war, especially in war, thinking matters. That logic, carried into the cockpit and tested against gravity and violence and fear, could be the difference between going home and not coming home. He never mocked the instinct pilots. He never claimed to be better. He just offered another way. A way that required patience, humility, and a willingness to be laughed at by people who didn't yet understand. He absorbed the mockery. He ignored the doubt. And when the time came, when 8 Focke-Wulfs filled his mirrors and no one was there to help, he proved that math wasn't the opposite of bravery. It was bravery's most reliable ally.